All right, we're going to call this meeting to order. Everybody's here. So, George, take it over.
Mayor, first of all, I appreciate the council agreeing to meet on relatively short notice for a short meeting, and understand that there's a tree lighting event, and some of you are very involved in that and need to be outside at 5:30. So I'm going to go through about 5 slides, if that's okay, just the purpose of which is to bring you up to speed on where we are. And I gave you a memo on the 26th, just before Thanksgiving, that really described essentially where we are. A lot hasn't changed, but we've had several more discussions. So I just want to kind of summarize that again and then make a recommendation to you on path forward. And you have a second item on your agenda tonight to consider a resolution that would authorize a reimbursement resolution that would allow us to issue some debt to help solve this problem. So with that, let me just go through these slides pretty quickly, and then we'll entertain some questions. And I think, yes, Lakita is here. I need to look to be sure if she wasn't. She's fired. But first of all, let me talk. The last meeting when we had discussion on that and I received direction from the council was at your meeting on November the 19th. And at that meeting, you'll remember that you authorized us to contract with whoever was necessary, but essentially with a company called Systems and Software, who is the vendor for the city of Arlington that does their customer service billing, and with a company called Vertex One, which is the company that Fathom was encouraging all of their customer cities to contract with on long-term contracts to continue billing services that Fathom had been providing. You authorized us to enter into both of those as is necessary. At this point, neither of those contracts has been signed. I'll get into a little bit more about that in a minute, although S&S, the vendor for Arlington, is still very much a player, and we may still need to sign a contract with them, although it might be modified from what we had originally anticipated. Since that meeting, several things have occurred that I outlined in that memo to you on the 26th. Vertex One, the company that was going to do the billing on an interim basis or would have taken it over on a permanent basis for some of the cities, is no longer an option. They're not a player in this. We'd gotten word of that in a roundabout way last week, but I had personal and direct conversations with them this week, and they are clearly not an option for us to look at anymore. And the reason for that is they received limited number of customer cities who were willing to sign those contracts, many of whom were looking at other options. And in my discussions with them, they were just having some difficulty getting where they needed to with Fathom as well. So they have backed away from participating in this remedy for all of the cities. Another thing that has happened is that we have received, and I pointed out to you in that memo that we wrote a letter over Wayne's signature to Fathom prior to Thanksgiving, essentially suggesting to Fathom that they needed to live up to their contract requirements in our separation agreement and provide data to Arlington and to us. And when I wrote that memo to you, we had not heard from Fathom in response to that letter. Although we have now, and the following Saturday, the city of Arlington and we now have access to a limited amount of data regarding our customers. It's the same kind of data that other cities had received from them. It's not directly transferable to the Arlington billing system, but it does provide spreadsheets of customer data that we can then use to at least know things like their last meter readings, what their customer counts are, that kind of information. So we now have in our possession enough data that we could build a billing system. The question is going to be, how do we go about doing that and what's the most efficient way? We have also been looking at other options that are available to us as we've been discussing with Arlington and with Fathom. One of those is with another company called Muni Billing, which is a company that has now contracted with some of Fathom's customers to either do their customer billing on an interim basis or on a permanent basis. Some of those employees, or at least are former employees of Fathom, and who are very familiar with their system, but it's an entirely different company and one that we feel pretty comfortable with if we need to engage them for temporary services or for permanent services. And I'll get more into that in a minute when I get to some recommendations. Other company that we've talked to, and I had mentioned to you before, is Aclara. Aclara is the company, the software company, that actually reads our meters. They are the company that when we've got these transmitting devices on everybody's water meter, it transmits the readings every month to a data center here in the city. We've got 6 of those data collection locations, and then it's transmitted to Aclara, which is then provided to Fathom for the billing purposes. Aclara, when we finally talked to them, was agreeable and willing to contract directly with us or with the city of Arlington, but there are some obstacles to that, and they could only do that if a couple of things occurred. One is that we could clearly identify that we own those devices and those data collection centers, and I think we can do that. But the other was that the assets of Fathom are tied up in receivership with the bank. And we have not yet gotten word what the bank will allow to occur with those assets. So we're still waiting for information on that, and it's kind of a wait over which we have no control, particularly when we have a difficult time communicating with both Fathom and Aclara. So right now that's still an option, but it's one that's looking less and less likely to occur, although Aclara is willing to do it. So that's kind of some things we've been doing in the interim since your meeting on the 19th. Let me talk for a minute about Arlington options. And again, this is, you remember when we entered into the contract with Arlington for operation and maintenance of our system a year ago? A part of that agreement, the O&M agreement, was that if we could transition out and away from Fathom, that they would be willing to take on our customer billing. We worked through a long, complicated agreement with Fathom to do that separation agreement and the scope of work and things they would provide to the city of Kennedale and the city of Arlington to facilitate that transition. We were halfway through that process when Fathom announced that they were going to close their door. So, so the contract with the possible options are still that we could contract with Aclara, either on a temporary or permanent basis, although that could cause further delay and potentially eliminate the need to replace our MIUs. If we in fact could contract with this company, which is in Phoenix, they could continue to read the meters, provide that data to Arlington. It's conceivable we could avoid replacing our MIUs on each meter. But another option is to contract, or under the current O&M agreement, the agreement we already have in place with Arlington, we could pay Arlington to enter all of our customers. Let's say there's between 3,200 and 3,500 customer meters that we have. And rather than going through a complicated process of trying to use that data in those spreadsheets to somehow, they could manually, using either S&S, their vendor, or their staff, they could enter those customers into their system just as they would a new customer. If you move to Arlington, you walk in, you set up a new account, they could set that up, and they could get every customer entered into the system, and it'd take them about a month to get that done, apparently, or less. So they could do that. There'd be a cost we would pay them. But whatever we paid Arlington to do that would reduce or modify the amount of our potential agreement with S&S, their vendor, because they don't need to duplicate what each other's doing. What we now think is that Arlington staff could do that less expensively than S&S could do it, because the agreement we had with S&S, the amount of money you all had authorized me to spend with S&S, was based on the premise that they would get the data from Fathom in a more usable form than Fathom has provided. So what the exact cost of getting that data translated in all of our customers on Arlington system is, I don't know, but we're estimating it would be about $100,000. We're getting a more refined, specific number from Arlington for that. We talked to them today about getting a better number on that, but I think it's safe to say we're going to pay Arlington and S&S somewhere around between over $100,000 to get that accomplished. So, and I think we can do it under the terms of a contract we negotiated with Arlington to do all of our operation and maintenance. And we could contract with Arlington to actually physically come out and perform the work and install those new MIUs that would be identical to the ones they use on their own system, and which they've already tested in Kennedale, so that they know they can successfully get the readings, they can read our meters if those MIUs are changed out. Now, full disclosure, I think it's conceivable and possible that we could take the time and and might be able to find a vendor of those same MIUs and get a bid price for acquiring them and installing them that would be less expensive than having Arlington do it at a cost that we're estimating at this point of $500,000. The likelihood that we could buy those meters at a less cost and a lower cost than Arlington is buying them, because they're replacing 10,000 of them a year, and they've got enough probably in stock to come out here and do ours. I can't imagine that we could go through a long process, delay this further, and acquire meters any less expensively than we're getting them from Arlington. But we're trying to refine that number. But we could do that and have Arlington do both of those things, convert the data, Arlington and S&S, and replace the MIUs on our meters. And again, this is the key point here, is what the cost of it will be, and we talked about that a little bit on the 19th. Recommendation, and again, I'm not trying to rush through this. You've got an item on your agenda tonight to at least get us started in that direction if you're comfortable with it. But my recommendation to you is that you approve the reimbursement resolution that's on your agenda tonight. And it's written so that it would be up to $600,000 to acquire and install those new MIUs. Whether we pay Arlington to do it or another contractor to do that, all this does is document that you've authorized us to move in that direction. It's not issuing the debt yet. That would come back to you at another time. So this simply gets that process started so we can say to Arlington, assuming they agree to all of this, go forth and do this work, and we're going to pay you for it. And we've got a source of funding to pay for it. And what would happen is you would authorize that resolution, or approve that resolution. It would authorize, we would then authorize Arlington to proceed with that extra work under the O&M agreement. And again, I've asked Wayne to look at our agreement. I've talked to Craig Cummings in Arlington. He has looked at the agreement. We believe clearly we wrote that agreement with the intent that they could take on extra work if something unexpected like this came along, and we can do it under our contract with Arlington and probably get a better price than we could get trying to do it ourselves. So again, the recommendation is approve the resolution, and then we'll have it if we make the decision to go ahead and issue the debt. Then if Arlington agrees to do these things and get started on it, and they then start billing us for the work, we would pay for them for that work as we're invoiced for it by the city of Arlington out of current available water and sewer reserve funds. We would, and by doing that, we would convert the data, get the MIUs purchased and installed. We might, and more than likely, would need to contract with Muni Billing for up to 90 days while Arlington gets all of this work done to get our customer accounts set up, and they may have to use estimated consumptions or last month's consumption. But frankly, our preference is not to go 30 days or a month without getting water and sewer revenue. So we need to try to contract with Muni Services. Now, if Arlington could do the same thing, I'd rather deal with Arlington, frankly, have them doing all of it for us rather than another company that we're not familiar with. And there are all kinds of reasons that I think Arlington is a safer path to go down than any other company that we don't know much about, but we need to do the customer billing. Right now, we believe Muni Billing is willing and able to do the customer billing for us. If we give them the go-ahead to do that, we'll have to pay for that. I don't know how much it would be for 30 or 90 days yet, but I can't contract with them until we at least have your authority on a path forward with all of this. So, and the other thing, again, in full disclosure, is that Arlington's trying to answer all of these questions too. So that as we're talking about contracting with Arlington to come out here and do this work, they're going to have staff doing it, both the data conversion and the meter MIUs with their staff on an overtime basis. So, or to a large extent on an overtime basis. And we're trying to nail down what that cost would be. And it's not inconceivable to me, although I hope this isn't the case, that the city of Arlington would decide they don't want to do that. And they'd rather we just go pay for it however we can elsewhere and hand them something that says, here, start billing our customers. I don't think that's going to be the case. They've been very cooperative with us to this point, but it's a financial decision on their part too. What we're trying to impress upon them is give us a reasonable price and justify it, and we're going to pay those costs that are provided in our O&M contract that we can do. So that's the recommendation. One more slide, and let me talk about what the debt would be. We're talking about issuing tax notes. I've had discussions with our financial advisors about this at some length, and what we'd be doing is tonight you would approve a reimbursement resolution. It's on your agenda to at least consider. The amount on that is $600,000, and that's because we're still unclear on exactly what the capital cost and the installation cost will be. But whatever it is we'll only issue the amount of debt of that $600,000 that we think we need to actually get this accomplished. We would use current water fund reserves to pay it up front. The reimbursement resolution is just exactly that. It's authorization and approval by the council that we could use current funds and reimburse ourselves when we issue the debt. We would then issue the tax notes as they're needed and reimburse the water fund for that. Now, I can tell you that I hope that we can, if we can get all of these ducks in a row and get this approved, and Arlington is amenable to all of these provisions, that we could hopefully have the entire system pursuant to our O&M agreement and our original intent in Arlington's hands and operating probably not later than the end of March, maybe, or I'd hope earlier than that. But in my opinion, I think this is going to get all of our operation out away from any other private company somewhere else in the country that, and Arlington is a government agency. They've probably got, I'm estimating, 100,000 meters. They're not going to be doing something with their system that would be detrimental to ours if we're on the same system that's not detrimental to their own system. And clearly they operate a very well-managed operation. So that's my recommendation to you, that we proceed with at least keeping the door open to issue this debt and contract with Muni Services if we have to in order to keep interim services going so we can keep billing during the months that Arlington is working on these other issues. And I'll quit talking and let you ask questions, try to respond to questions.
Any questions? Josh?
How much is in the water fund reserve now?
It's over $1 million, I'm not sure.
We're budgeted to end the year at 1.3 million.
And as soon as we issued the tax notes, we'd replace that fund with the tax note proceeds. So it'd go back in there.
Chris?
No, sir.
Sandra? Linda?
One other thing for us all to kind of keep in mind, I think, is you mentioned maybe having to estimate the billing for December, and I understand that. but also our winter sewer average is based upon consumption for December, January, and February. So, that may have some concerns with our residents, but I know in dealing with that in the past, estimating is not an unusual thing to have to do at times, like when a meter goes bad and stuff. Just something for us to kind of be
And
mindful of.
clearly, Linda, I think that's a good point. We're going to be very sensitive to that issue if it comes up with any customer, as we would be with any question about whether a bill had been paid or not during this interim period that affected a cutoff list of some kind. So we'll be very sensitive to that and probably postpone that kind of an action unless we can clearly identify its bills that haven't been paid.
Chad?
When you were saying that you weren't sure about the bank assets, were you talking about the current MIUs that are on our?
No, what I'm talking about is apparently any asset that belongs to Fathom, as I understand it, is now in receivership by the Silicon Valley Bank. I don't think our MIUs or our data collection centers are included in an asset that belong to Fathom because we paid for those and we own them. That was one of the questions I was going to talk to Fathom about today to make sure they agreed with that. And Frank, we had a meeting scheduled at 1 o'clock today on the phone with Arlington and Fathom. And as I was dialing into the call, they canceled it. Fathom did. So we've now got it rescheduled for Thursday. I'd like for it to have occurred before tonight so I could ask them that kind of a question about ownership of those assets.
And that was just my other question, is if we own those, is there the possibility for a buyback of those to another company or?
Well, we've talked about that too, because on the assumption that we own those and they're removed, they belong to us, and we could certainly try to market them, maybe get some of our money back for that.
Okay.
And we would try to identify other customers who use those same kind of devices.
That's really all I had.
But my legal question is that, do we have to go out for an RFP if we're spending this amount of money? I mean, usually you've got to go out and have competitive bidding, right?
Right. If we're going to purchase any of these systems from a third-party vendor and they cost more than $50,000, then the competitive bidding statute would apply. But anything we purchase from Arlington, I'm of the opinion we can do that without competitive bidding it. We'll do it through our contract with them. We don't have to competitively bid it. So the $500,000 estimate for the MIUs, if Arlington's going to sell those to us and install those, we can avoid competitive bidding for that. The software, I'm not familiar with the S&S and whether or not we have to purchase anything there. But if we're just paying Arlington for their personnel, their services to transcribe data into a format that they can utilize, then that's not something we would competitively bid either. So, yeah, as long as we're going through Arlington and our contract, then we can avoid the competitive bidding.
All right, any other questions? All right, I'll entertain a resolution or a motion on Resolution 563.
I'll make the motion that we approve Resolution 563 as presented by the city manager.
Do you have a second?
I second.
Any further discussion? Well, please raise your hand since
Yeah, we're not voting, I'm sorry, we're not voting on the iPads.
yeah, all those in favor, raise your hand. Motion passes unanimously. I need a motion to adjourn.
George, you don't need anything under item 1. You've got all the authorizations previously. Yeah, okay.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor, raise your hand. Okay, motion passes unanimously. We'll go off to the Christmas tree lighting.